Good morning. I want to talk today about stage 4 of the 8-stage learning design framework that deals with intended learning outcomes. So you know who your students are, you know the context in which you're writing your program for, you know the media choices. You then need to draft intended learning outcomes. You're drafting them at this stage. Nothing that you write down will be carved in stone. You will have the opportunity to come back and revise it as you go through the next 2 stages as part of the kind of model of constructive alignment, but I'll talk about that separately. So we're going to draft intended learning outcomes. I'm a big fan of intended learning outcomes, and I know not everyone is, but I think it's important just to recognize that they do provide, if they're well written, they provide sufficient guidance and support for the student as to what they're going to be doing, and guidance for you as the designer and any subsequent teacher on the program as to the purpose of the teaching. So I think it's very important that everyone revisit the whole notion of intended learning outcomes. There's been a lot of very bad practice, or certainly very poor practice, that was brought in very early on into higher education, largely because the only possible taxonomy that was available was Bloom's taxonomy. And so higher education has adopted Bloom's taxonomy, but Bloom only dealt with the intellectual skills. So if you only adopt Bloom's taxonomy, Bloom's cognitive taxonomy, you only address intended intellectual skills. Now, clearly, higher education is about much more than just intellectual skills, as important as they are. And so what education has done, certainly what higher education course designers have done, is to recognize that there are some other requirements, some communication skills, and so they put a bit of group work in. But effectively what they haven't done is they haven't gone back and revisited all of the various domains of learning and integrated them through intended learning outcomes into their program, and that's what I encourage everyone to do. So there are 5 different domains of learning in my model of learning. There are other variations, people call them different things, but essentially I'm taking 5 domains which I believe do address all of the various facets of learning. So there's the cognitive domain, which is intellectual skills, based on Bloom's taxonomy with some modifications by Anderson and Krathel in 2001, and I've made some further changes. There's then the metacognitive domain, which I've derived from the dimensions of learning that Anderson and Krathel developed in 2001. Then there's the affective domain, largely based on Bloom's work in the 1950s and 60s. Then there's the psychomotor domain, which I've adopted a version of Rwanda Dave's psychomotor domain. And then there's the interpersonal domain, which I've basically created pretty much by fusing scholarship from a wide different range of areas. Now, there will be other videos on these particular taxonomies. Essentially, so cognitive is intellectual skills. Metacognitive is essentially the knowledge orientation, personal epistemologies, if you like, towards learning. Affective is values, psychomotor is manual or dexterity skills, and the interpersonal skills covers things like cultural awareness, cross-cultural learning effectively, conflict resolution, communication, collaboration, all of the things that are interpersonal skills. Now, I think if you write intended learning outcomes that cover all of those 5 domains, you end up with a very solid program. Now, faculty will sometimes say, well, how possibly can I assess all of these outcomes? Well, you don't assess each outcome by an individual piece of assessment. And in fact, one of the challenges that people have had historically is if they write 5 intellectual outcomes and they could only have students sit a final exam, that's quite a stretch. if you, for example, have an intellectual outcome that says to analyze, and you have a psychomotor outcome that talks about the manipulation of a particular database, then obviously assessing those two at the same time is entirely possible. You set up an assessment where students are charged to retrieve data from a database and analyze it, and then you're hitting both targets. So it's about having a little bit of imagination. So in terms of my guidance is always that you should write as many outcomes as are required, and I would suggest a 5 is minimum if you are trying to reflect the full breadth of learning experiences. I think it's a mistake to impose an institutional limit on the number of outcomes, but they have to be very well crafted. So if somebody writes 12 outcomes on a single module, clearly hasn't understood the notion of writing learning outcomes. Okay, so I think the right number is probably somewhere between 6 and 10. Depending on the credit weighting of a particular module. But the point is that you're not, that this direct equivalence that says, well, it's a 10 credit module, 100 hours of learning, therefore it's only got 4 outcomes. And if it's 200 hours, 20 credits, it's going to have 8 modules, 8 outcomes. It doesn't work that way. It's about the skills that module is intended to convey. It's not impossible that you might have a module that has 3 outcomes, but I think I would aim and encourage people to think about 6 to 10, certainly to start with, so that they ensure that they are rounding out the learning experience of the student. So writing those outcomes at stage 4, which is a very developmental process, a lot of time and effort in a course team is spent on doing that, because it allows them to think really seriously about the skills that not the content, but the skills that students are going to acquire through encounter facilitation with particular content. So it's a very important part of the process. How you write intended learning outcomes, I will do in detail in a future video. But I think it's important just to note that a really well structured outcome is flexible enough to change with contexts. So it's about how you write them. They need to be sufficiently generic to be adaptable, but sufficiently specific to tell students what it is you want them to learn. So writing outcomes across all domains, getting the balance right in a particular module is also very important. It's also worth noting that not all modules have to be intellectual modules. You may have very much skills modules. And it's very interesting to see how people sometimes struggle to write outcomes on a module, literally because they're unfamiliar with the other domains of learning. So I hope that's interesting, and I will do a little bit more on outcomes in other videos.